All right, we are in 1 Kings chapter 19.
So we just this morning we were first.
Don't we not want to be here with kids? Oh, that was 1 Kings 11. I'm sorry. No, we skipped through 11.
Yeah, no, that was Solomon, and that was 11. This is actually much later. So 1 Kings chapter 19, we've been talking about whom? Elijah. And so we're going to look at Elijah today, and then when we come back to talk about Elijah again, we won't be in 1 Kings anymore because this is the last reference of Elijah in 1 Kings, and we're getting near actually the end of his life. Not the end yet, but we're getting toward the end. The next time we're going to bump into him is in 2 Kings, even though there's a couple chapters here. Before we get to this, there is an intervening gap here, and there's a couple stories that are very cool to read. They're very interesting. The story that is most noted after what we're going to talk about tonight is actually the story of King Ahab, and we all know who King Ahab is, right? Yeah. He's the king. No, he's not Ahab the Arab. That's a song. He's like king of the junkyard dogs, or I don't know. Anyway, so Ahab, we run into an account where Ahab decides that there's this little vineyard outside of his castle area that he desires, but it's owned by somebody who has inherited this land for multiple generations and doesn't want to sell it. And so Jezebel has this guy murdered. His name is Naboth. This is an interesting passage to read. There is, if you could say there were a famous sermon, you would have the Sermon on the Mount, would be a famous sermon. There, you two, park. There is a... He doesn't like to be wrangled. There is a famous sermon, actually, that's preached about this story of King Ahab and Naboth and Jezebel murdering Naboth. It's a sermon called Payday Someday, written originally by a guy named R.G. Lee, who was a Southern Baptist pastor, the 20th century. He wrote this message. It was not even originally like a Sunday morning message. It's a lengthy message, but it was actually like a Wednesday night message. And it actually became easily his most popular message. It was printed and published no less than 7 times. And he was invited to different churches specifically to preach this message and preached it over 1,200 times. Wow. This is like the Payday Someday World Tour. Huh? Yeah, it's crazy because like in church world, you just don't get this very often. And it's funny talking to musicians. They're like, I was playing this gig and we were about done, and these people walked in and they liked the music, but we were about done with our set, and so they gave us $100 to play an extra hour. And I turned to them like, in church world, that never happens. I would get people say they'd pay me $100 to stop, but never to keep going. It just doesn't happen, and so it's kind of unusual. But it gives you an idea of Dr. Lee he was a very gifted communicator, very interesting message, very graphic and visual, not like graphic, but just, he talks about, Ahab with a toad who squatted upon the throne of Israel, and very, very, kind of graphic. Very cool if you can ever find it. There are a couple audio recordings. I have heard it delivered in audio, and I do actually have a manuscript of it as well. Very interesting stuff. And this story takes place kind of between where we're going to talk about tonight and where we're going to get to later on. Elijah is actually not really present for that particular piece. So coming back now to our story, though, where did we leave Elijah? Do you remember? Okay, he went to the mountain and he hung out with God for a while. He got a revelation of God. And then, why are you here, Elijah? Why are you still here, Elijah? And he gave him a job to do. Do you remember? He gave him 3 specific tasks to do.
Anoint a new prophet.
Okay, anoint a prophet who is going to replace him. And a pair of kings, not the show, but he was sent to anoint a pair of kings. Yeah. So That was what Elijah did. So Elijah leaves now the mountain where he was sent, and he goes out to do this. He goes out to anoint these two kings and anoint another prophet who's going to take his position when he passes on. And so it brings us to 1 Kings chapter 19, and we'll pick up in verse 15 just to kind of get a running start at where we're heading tonight, because we're not going to cover much ground, as strange a thought as that might be. So the Lord said to him, to Elijah, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria, and you shall anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place. It shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elijah will kill. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." And God said, we're going to have us a national revival, and we're going to have us a revival by means of attrition. Meaning that if you don't worship me, we'll kill you, and whoever's left, they'll worship me. It's a revival of attrition. And so Elijah is sent out on this mission. And then we get into verse 19, which is new material for us. So he departed from there, and he found Elisha. Now, I don't know why God had to choose somebody whose name was quite so close. Because Elijah and Elisha, they if you start getting Bible trivia, eventually you will get these two dudes' names wrong, because they sound a lot alike. They had similar character qualities. They worked together, and Elisha followed Elijah. And you'll remember some of the events, but you'll forget which one came first. And so, I don't know why, but God said Elisha is going to be the guy who replaces you, Elijah. And their names, even in meaning, are very close together. So he departed, he finds this guy named Elisha, the son of Shaphat. Now notice in verse 19, he was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he was with the 12th. So we learn a lot about Elisha in that statement. Do you realize how much we just learned? Okay. Okay. Let's think about this. Let's start off with the most obvious. How many oxen are 12 yoke of oxen? 24. A yoke is 2. You've seen those big, milk yoke things, the big wooden thing. It's so you can put 2 oxes together and they work. They didn't have tractors, so it's like, horsepower. You've got 1 ox power, 2 ox power. You start chaining them together and they pull them in a vertical line. So he's got 12 yoke of oxen. He's got 24 oxen in line plowing. And he's plowing with the 12 yoke. So he's got 24 oxes, so you got to watch where you're walking. Fertilize as you plow, I guess. It saves time. How much money is an oxen worth? Is an ox worth? Okay. Now, do you think a little bit of money or a lot of money? Okay. Oxen were actually quite expensive. And so, for a farmer to have an ox was, kind of a goal and a necessity. If you were poor, you might have had a donkey, but you couldn't afford an ox because they were more expensive. They were larger, quite a bit more powerful. But to have one was a deal. To have a yoke of oxen meant you were accomplishing something. You were getting along pretty well in the farming industry if you had a yoke of oxen, because, man, just think of all of the ground you can plow with that much muscle dragging your plow through the ground. Okay? So 2 meant you're pretty affluent. 12 yoke? Exactly. This is wealth on display. Elisha, you're talking about somebody who actually comes from a very wealthy family. Odds are fair, if he's out plowing with these 12 oxen, that this is not even everything they have. This is just what he's working with. So we find, first of all, that Elisha comes from money, a lot of it. Secondly, that we find that some of the ground that Elisha is working here is not easy ground. That if you, usually you can plow with a donkey, Hard ground you might need an oxen. Really hard ground you'll need 2. But when you have chained together 24 oxen to drag your plow through the ground, you're dealing with ground that is not easy ground to get. So he's expanding the empire into places where, they haven't necessarily farmed before, but this field is going down. And so he's out there. And so we learn, there's a little bit of an expansionist mindset here going on along with the wealth, and that a lot of times goes together. But we find him actually locked in with that 12th yoke, probably the last yoke, but it could have been the first, but no, the 12th yoke was in the back. So he's there with the back, and what is he doing? Is he just kind of lounging? Like he's got his chase lounger set up between 2, maybe a hammock, between 2 yoke of oxen, and just swaying along as they're working? He's not even standing behind the plow steering. He is standing between the oxen with his shoulder to it, pushing. So when we see Elijah here standing and plowing with these 12 yoke of oxen and him buckled into that last yoke, pushing with it, you've got a guy who is wealthy, you've got a guy who is set on expanding into hard territory, and you've got a guy who is tough as nails, and he's going to throw down with the oxen and help them push. This is not, this is not your average, rich kid of privilege. This is a kid who is determined we're going to take this thing further. And if I have to, blood, sweat, and tears to get this field done, we're going to get her done. And so like I said, when we see this described about Elisha, we learn a lot about Elisha in a very condensed space once we begin to unpack it and think about it. And so then we also learn something about Elijah's character. Now, anybody doubt Elijah's toughness to date? Let's think about it. What do we know about Elijah? Let's see. The first time we introduced to him, he's yelling at the king. They're smart for you. And not only is he yelling at the king, he's insulting the king, and he's telling the king that he's a lousy king and he's a godless king. And by the way, it ain't going to rain for a while. So take that. And then he leaves. And then we see him in the desert hanging out at McRaven. And then we see him at the widow ladies there in Zarephath. And we see him actually raising the dead. And then we see him going to the king again and going, "You're the problem with this nation, king, but let's have us a religious throwdown." And so he calls out 450 prophets of Baal. He's like, 450 on one. Sounds like good odds to me. And so they bring them together, and they have this throwdown on Mount Carmel. And at the end of the day, after he's insulted the king, all of the prophets, everybody he could possibly insult and imaginable, he goes and he prays, and a short prayer, God, fire. Okay, we're done. What does he do then? He gets all the priests rounded up, and he takes them down by the river, and just one at a time. Maybe 2 at a time because it saves energy. But, he physically, literally, chops 450 dudes' heads off. Okay, is Elijah a tough guy? I think he qualifies for that title. One of the toughest prophets in the Bible. Do you think he was easy to get along with? Is there a reason he spent a lot of time by himself? He was stubborn. I mean, he was right, but he was stubborn. And if you disagreed, you were just wrong. There's you can do it my way or you can do it the wrong way. This is Elijah. And we see his character come out in a great way here. In the middle of verse 19, then Elijah passed by him, speaking of Elisha, and he threw his mantle on him. Thanks. And so get the scene. He's just walking around, and he's got this, you think about, they're all wearing dresses anyway, but he's got this outer mantle, this outer garment. It's kind of a long vest kind of thing. And he's walking by Elisha. He's like, and he just keeps on walking. How's this for, hey, you, can you come be my assistant? Hey, you're going to replace me. No, here, I'm throwing my clothes at you. Go wash them. This is not a call. I've never gotten a call like this, a job offer. My boss just threw a computer at me or something. Which is convenient because, one, they're expensive, and two, that could hurt. Although I guess, being on disability. Huh? It still hurts. So Elijah passed by him and literally just throws his clothes at him. And he, who? Elisha, let's keep the name straight. And Elisha left the oxen and ran after Elijah. And he says to him, please let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you. And so Elisha gets it. I would have been like, hey, dude, keep your laundry to yourself. Yeah, I'm like, this is a no littering zone, buddy. I'm working here. But Elisha picks up this mantle that Elijah has thrown at him, and he runs up to him and says, let me go say goodbye to my parents, and I will follow you. Like gruff dude to gruff dude. This is communication, apparently. I don't know. Wrestlers even talk more than this. I don't know. And Elijah said to him, go back again, for what have I done to you? He's like, forget you then. Like, what do I care? I don't need you. Nice guy. What have I done to you? Go home, spoiled little rich brat. And you can see him just like pacing on, and he walked like an ape or something. and so he says, like, yeah, go home, whatever. I don't care. And he just leaves. This is great. This is a total transition of prophetic power. Organized by cavemen. So Elisha turned back from him, and he took a yoke of oxen, and he slaughtered them. And he boiled the flesh, using the oxen's equipment, and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and followed Elisha, and became his servant. And so Elisha, see, I told you, this will get confusing. Elisha goes back. I'm sure he said goodbye to mom and dad, but then he goes out there and he butchers 2 oxes. I mean, is this a big deal? This is a huge deal. I mean, this is a lot of meat for starters. And he takes the wooden yokes and he starts a fire with them and he cooks the oxen using the wood from the yokes. And then he just gives the meat to all of his servants. Just like gives it all away. So this is his farewell party that he throws by himself for himself. But you think about this particular move and what it signifies in Elisha's life. Because the oxen were wealth. I mean, these oxen were his inheritance that he's dealing with here, and he just kills them. What does he think of his inheritance versus the calling of God? Yeah, it's compared to the call of God on his life, as cryptically as it had been delivered. But compared to the call of God on his life, his wealth, his inheritance meant little. And just to make sure there was a clean break, he used the yoke to actually fuel the fire. How do you go back then to that life? You don't. You can't. The tools of his trade had been turned to ash. The status of wealth had been turned into food. And he went from being a wealthy inheritance to the servant of Elijah. Now, Elijah was perpetually in a bad mood. And so this had to be exciting. But Elijah wasn't like rolling in wealth here. I mean, his whole deal was, he opposed the king. That's not a good career move if you want to get ahead and make money. And so Elijah, like many prophets, subsisted on whatever they could find. I mean, this was the vow of poverty before vow of poverty became popular. There was no vow. It was just an understood. And so Elisha goes from being this very wealthy person with a great inheritance and a great future to being the servant of a prophet. Understanding that somewhere along the way he would step into that prophetic office, but understanding too that would never bring him great wealth, it would never bring him great fame, although, some 4,000 years later we're actually still talking about him, so I guess he didn't do too bad in the legacy department. But the calling of God, the value of doing whatever it is that God has called you to do, what kind of value do we place on that? And that's really something we have to wrestle with, because the reality is that each of us, God has something for us that he desires for us to do. Vocationally, career-wise, relationally, all of these things. He's got a purpose for our lives. But we have a choice of whether or not to follow that purpose. And the question is, once we become aware of the purpose, once we become aware of God's call on our life, whatever it may be, are we willing to sacrifice all that we think could be and should be and take a position that, humanly speaking, looks like a dead end so that we can follow the call of God? That's what's at stake. Now, what is God going to call you to do? I don't know. I mean, a lot of you guys are teenagers here. Is God going to call you to vocational ministry like what I do here? Maybe, but maybe not. I remember growing up and you think, oh, if God calls you, it must be ministry. No, I think God calls people to be mechanics. I think God calls people to be, electricians and plumbers and builders. We need all of these things, and God wires us differently for different tasks. A lot of us aren't wired to stand up here and yell at people, which is good, I think. But I dare say in even a room this size that there is at least one, maybe two, that God did wire and might actually call to do something similar to what I do. But is it more important to be a plumber for God than it is to be a pastor for God? Is it more important to be a pastor than it is to be an electrician? No, we need all of these things. But when the time comes where you really, honestly, sincerely believe this is what God is calling me to do, the question is, do you answer the phone to the call of God, or you keep going, no, this is what I want to do? Because the skill set He gave you can be used for His purposes, but it can also be used for your purposes. The question is, who gets to lead? God or you? And it's a question you can't answer yet, but it's a question I hope that as you begin thinking, especially teenagers, although adults, this could happen. I know many second and third career pastors. And people who, God really wants me to go do this. I've seen, CEOs retire and go be missionaries in foreign countries to work on stuff. It's crazy what God will invite us to do sometimes. The question is, can you prepare in your heart now for when that moment arrives? Because someday Elijah may walk by and throw his laundry in your face. This is what happened to Elisha. And he did not hesitate to go. He hesitated just so long enough to say goodbye, throw a farewell party, and leave. That's a decision you can make now. To say, whatever God calls me to do, as He reveals it, I'm just going to say yes. So I hope you will. So we're going to leave Elijah here, and we're going to pick him back up in 2